first of all, I'll say that I was a fairly brief member of the 3BO newsroom compared with Graeme, or Turpes as we knew him. I was there from 61 to 63, and I was there under the editorship of Dave Horsfall, and there was Terry Conroy and Graeme for some of the time. How long were you there, Graeme, at 3BO?
I joined in 1956. Was a transcription clerk and turntable operator, now called a DJ. Then went into the newsroom until about 1959, and then went to 2OI Albury, back to 3BO just in time for me to buzz off overseas, and then I went back late 61, I think, through to 63 and a half or 4. Little while after you'd gone, I'd gone to Melbourne, to the ABC.
And then you came back again?
Yeah, I came back in quite a deal further on. After working in Melbourne and in newspapers in Bendigo, I rejoined 3BO in 1984, and then 3BO took on other stations, Star FM and 3CV and Easy Mix, and I stayed basically with 3BO until I retired, 2004.
Right. So, who was the editor when you started in the newsroom at 3BO?
He was a fairly shortish, dark-haired man with a very fine Air Force moustache called Nick Carter. And he started off the 3BO News, which was fairly basic in those days.
Just the two of you, was it?
No, there was just Nick when I first arrived.
Right.
I was going back and forth to the Bendigo railway station picking up transcription discs of serials and radio shows which had to be played at certain times, then either destroyed or sent on to other stations, and then I was in the studio playing records for Russ Pilley and Ken Jelland and all those people, and then they required, when Nick Carter was going on leave, they also required someone in the newsroom. And I went in there and I loved it. I found that was the spot I wanted to be.
But, so you had no journalistic background, but presumably
I was
you knew how to write.
Yeah.
You understood basic grammar and spelling.
I had a crash course, and he then, to Nick's credit, he started to teach me a little, but he was not, I wasn't with him very long before. And I really can't remember when Dave Horsfall arrived, but Dave was appointed news editor from the Northern Times in Graeme, and he was the one who really taught me a lot of the journalist craft.
Well, he was fantastic energy,
energetic
man. Liked to drink or six, but
yes, it was good.
But he was amazing to work for. I always thought that. He was a guy who couldn't be intimidated by anyone, and in those days, when I was there from 61 to 63, the Bendigo Advertiser I thought was a pretty appalling paper, dull, but also uncontroversial to the extreme. I mean, that they never wanted to run anything that was going to cause any offence. And whereas Dave thought, to hell with this, if there was a story that needed to be told, we told it. No matter what the abuse was. Afterwards, and there was quite a bit of that. I don't know whether you had that experience of being rung up and told you were being sued.
Yes.
I think I must have been told I was being sued at least once a week, but no one ever did, of course.
No. Well, actually, Dave, when he arrived, to his credit, turned it from a local news service into a regional news service, because he got the engineers to show him the grid pattern of the signal, and he said, if people can hear us in Manangatang, we'll carry a story on Manangatang. And so he appointed correspondents, and we went from a few bulletins a day right through and his aim was to have a 7-day a week, if possible, and within the confines of commercial radio, which reluctantly employs anybody, let alone 3 or 4 journalists. So.
Yes, well, now you mention that's the regionalisation of the news is how I came to be at 3BO, because my family owned the Charlton Tribune and the Quambatook Times and the Witchy-Proof News, and briefly the Manangatoon Courier, would you believe? And Dave had me as his stringer, his correspondent for that era. And it was through that when the Charlton Tribune company was sold to Ian Cameron from Wedderburn, after a while I wanted to move on, and Dave offered me a job, so that's how I came to be working for 3BO. And you've already mentioned you worked with Russ Pilley, but what other people were there? Can you remember?
Yeah, there were Ted Bell and Frank Avis did a breakfast program, and they were forerunners really, because they used to do some crazy things. Ted Bell he was a sort of ventriloquist, so he had a birdseed chirpy,
really?
in the morning. And if someone happened to be working on the roof in the building next to us on the Beehive, and one morning so they got an extension cord and went out and did the breakfast program from out there. And Dave Horsfall actually, they did an outside broadcast from the Plaza Theatre on the veranda, and Dave brought his eagle in. You remember that?
Oh, I remember his eagle. Yes, I think he owned it illegally.
Yes, illegally. So we did a 24-hour broadcast from there, and Dave did he also said if we're going to do news services, we had to do it properly. So he got into the trades hall. We had to sometimes get kicked out, but we attended the trades hall meetings. All the council. And of course 3BO didn't run to any transport, so you had to catch the tram to Little Hawk, if you remember.
Yes, yeah.
And at 9:15, get the tram back again so you could do the news. So, but he...
we even did the Strathfield State Council.
Yes.
Dear, oh dear, was that dull.
But that was a good day because you had most of the day, and they offered, giving you a candle lunch while in the middle of the... So it was very good. But he really brought it on, and he started to introduce the editorials, for want of a better word, but he realised
this was news behind the news.
Sort of magazine thing.
Yeah, oh yeah, it was good. Well, you mentioned Russ Pilley and some others. Who else do you remember from your time?
I remember Russ, and you would too, because pre-television days in Australia, the evening program was the big program, and Russ used to do it. And he'd come in with about 2 packets of Rothmans filters, and put it on the side of the thing and light up, and smoke his way through the night.
That's right.
And we had the serials, Mrs. Obbs and Yes What and Martin's Corner, Burton's of Banner Street, D24, and
When a Girl Married.
Yes, all of those ones. And at night time, the Lux Radio Theatre. But we used to take ABC News on landline in those days. One of the first stations, regional stations in Australia to do it.
It was commercial stations. Ran it. I hate to be cynical about this, but I suspect that the AWA network, of which 3BO was part of, got it for nothing.
I think that might be the case.
So it saved them having to run their, pay for something.
That's right.
I always remember Des Tacchini, who had 2 lives. He was Des Tacchini, the disc jockey, and he used to do Conn's Coppers on Saturday morning.
Yes.
And then his other life was Ron Rico, the hypnotist.
That was fascinating.
And then there was Campbell Spain, who was never comfortable with modern music. His life for him was doing the classical programs. Was that
It
not
was,
right?
it was.
And didn't he have a grocer's shop, or family had a corner grocer's shop or something like that?
I can't recall that outside 3BO, but Campbell was a person who was fairly meticulous in
Yes,
in
yes, very meticulous.
And to my surprise, they said that he was, when in an earlier life, he was the chief engineer or an engineer at 3BO when they started. You know.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Well, he did understand the technical side very.
Yeah.
Well, then there was, I remember Malcolm Bell,
Yes.
and John Warren Drips, who insisted that he'd call himself on air John Drips. Well, that was his name, of course. But I mean, I think most people would have thought, well, as a broadcaster, I don't think John Drips is a very clever name. Why don't I call myself John Warren?
Yes.
And
There would have been the case. Yeah.
and there was the seriously odd, and I think I can say that without
being said.
just Rick Perry, who later became Rick Radford on the ABC in Darwin, I think, and he was the man who always insisted on reading the news under a table light, wasn't it?
Yes.
With no overhead lights on at all.
Must have been the ambience.
And which resulted, of course, in people with a mischievous inclination and who didn't much care for him anyway, would be slipping their hand in the door and flicking the switches on all the time. And he'd been known to get up and walk out of the studio,
Exactly.
go round the building demanding to know who it was.
And everything else.
And he also turned up for a shift one day and then announced he couldn't begin as planned because he'd left his condom at home. And I thought, well, yes, dream on, Rick. But at any rate, and he actually did go home, and someone else ran it.
Well,
And then there was Bill Moore, the terrifying chief engineer.
chief engineer. Bill was one of these old engineers who was extremely good at what he did, but he'd say we needed a new piece of equipment, but then nobody could use it.
No, well, that's right. I remember that all the interviews we did had to be as live because he refused to allow you to edit stuff because that was a waste of tape. And also it wore the heads out.
Yes, that's true. And announcers who actually queued up records. And
That's right. Oh, yes.
He hated that because it wore the needle.
Well, I mean, he was obviously the most powerful man in the station.
Yeah, he was.
But he had a young chap, Jeff Holland, there, who was his assistant, who was very good. And Jeff would sometimes help us work around some of Bill Moore's restrictions.
He did. And actually, the manager when I went there first was a chap called Hamilton Huntley, and he was famous for having sacked John Laws just before I arrived.
Right.
Because Laws...
The infamous John Laws.
Yes, Laws told a story when he was back in Bendigo for his 50-year on air that he got sacked from 3BO because he started a serial and then was having a dalliance with his girlfriend and the serial finished before he did, more or less. And so it was dead air and he got the bullet. And then was it Frank McManus then?
Well, I think it was Frank McManus when I came, because he went off to BCV8 when it was the Bendigo's first commercial television channel when it started. And it was taken over by Keith Duncan, who was, well, he was all right. I mean, the one thing about Keith Duncan, there were many stories about him, and we don't have time to tell them all.
No, we don't.
But he supported Dave whenever there was trouble over a story we'd written. He always backed Dave, not that the complaints with the stories were wrong. It was just that there were complaints that we ran them at all.
Yeah, that we actually said it.
and you know, you shouldn't have run this story, you shouldn't have done that, and I think, you know, Keith Duncan always supported the news department.
Yeah.
And there was Al Scown.
Al Scown and Eric Patterson.
Eric Patterson.
Yeah. And they were a good pair on air because they...
One did sales, or did they both do sales?
They both did sales and basically produced a lot of the commercials for the station. And basically, administratively, they were the managers, you know, right hand. They were the people who would next go on to another station to be manager. Yeah. But they were still pretty down to earth people.
And they were quite funny because they used to do these commercials, ad-lib commercials, didn't they?
Yes.
For was it the cinema?
Yes. They used to talk about what programs came up at the Lyric Theatre or Plaza or the Royal Princess or whatever theatres were. And they were innovative too. When you listen to them now, probably you shudder a little bit, but I mean, that was radio in those days.
Yeah, and it was completely off the cuff. I mean, the idea of working from a script or rehearsing what you were going to say.
No, they had the name of the movie and who was in it.
That was their starting point, and off they went.
Yeah, so they were very good in that respect. And I must admit, most of the announcers who were there, and they read live a lot of the time on the air. There's hardly any recorded.
No, well, Bill Law wouldn't allow us to pre-record stuff. No. But someone else who was there, I think, during your time as well was Brian Whetstone, wasn't it?
Yes.
Brian Whetstone was a very good broadcaster, but a very emotional man. But he went off to England and he worked for a while on the pirate ships. I think it was Radio Caroline he worked on. And because working on Radio Caroline was, I think it was illegal if you lived in Britain.
Yes, and everyone listened to it. But
that's right. Yeah. Well, he changed his name to John Sidney.
Yeah.
And he returned to Australia, and I think he worked for 3AW for a while, but he had a wonderful voice and became an opera singer. And sadly, I believe he's now dead.
Gee.
Anyone else you can remember?
I'm trying to think, and as your memory plays tricks as you get a bit older, of course, and I'm trying to remember some of the others that were there. We probably you wouldn't say we remembered the office girls and other people there, would we? No.
Wasn't Nancy Waller used to do the women's program in the morning, didn't they?
Yes, she did.
That was in the days when women journalists, of course, were always consigned to the social pages because they were. Frankly, they couldn't deal with real news, could they?
Well,
and Nancy
that
Waller
was the established custom.
That's right, and there were a good bunch there. But I mean, one thing that I remember, which I suppose it was touching on the notorious, was when we had a charity football match, and to promote it, Des Stacchini went into his Ron Rico the Hypnotist mode with Campbell Spain doing the recording, and they hypnotised me on air to become Mrs. Florrie Brown, the mother of one of the top footballers in this charity football match. And that was quite good fun, and I didn't think that it would work. Although I'd been hypnotised before, I just didn't think it would work. But at any rate, I got all dressed up and we went off with John. They had at the bottom of the stairs, because 3BO used to be above the beehive.
Very steep flights of stairs.
What was it, Pall Mall?
Pall Mall. Yeah. And Beehive was one of the original old buildings of Bendigo with, 3.5, 4 metre high ceilings and all that.
Well, they got me all dressed up with wig and everything, and John Drips was dressed up as a baby, and he was very tall, so it looked pretty funny.
All you saw was arms and legs out of the pram.
Out of the pram, and I thought, this is not going to work. This is not going to work. Anyway, when I came down the stairs, there was the pram, and suddenly, like that, I suddenly became Mrs. Brown, as Des Keeney Rodrigo had told me I would, and he gave me a shopping list, and so I pushed the pram around with the streets all around 3BO packed with all these people who come to see this.
Radio used to attract thousands of people.
Yeah, well, it caused near enough to a traffic jam in Bendigo, and I went off with Des's shopping list and did all that, and that was quite funny. And then afterwards, when I got back to 3BO, I was back into the oldie and Richardson again.
Yes.
I mean, what can you remember? Any other sort of things?
There was a man
mischief making.
Perhaps on one of their charity drives, they sat a man. I think Jack Crawford was his name, but he scaled a pole which was about probably 20 metres high outside the Glahawk town hall, and he was up there for a day and a half as well to do that. You know, they had a lot of. And as I say, outside broadcasts on verandas and things like that. And they actually, in those days, if they were doing stunts, you used to have to cart all the equipment with you.
Oh, yes.
These heavy Bayer tapes.
Oh, I know.
And everyone nearly dislocated their shoulders carrying these things around. Nowadays, it's as easy as, well...
Well, just to go back to Des Keeney quickly, Des Keeney always told me that he got his first radio job up in Brisbane when he turned up for the job with one of these newfangled tape recording machines. Because before that they were wire recording machines, which was a nightmare, because if the wire broke, it just sprung everywhere. And I mean, some of the equipment we had, it was so heavy, but it's ludicrous now that we've got. I mean, let me just show you something. I'm also recording the sound on this. Now, this is top quality recording this is doing, and isn't that amazing? Whereas we used to have to carry this equipment which would just about break your back.
Yeah, microphones, windsocks, and 10-inch reels, and all that sort of stuff.
And those old pink acetate discs that could only be used once or twice because they wore out.
That's right.
That's right. Well, those were the days, eh, Turpie?
They were. And when they went, nowadays, of course, one thing that surprised me, as I was when I left Bendigo in 64, they had record library, 78 RPMs, 45s, microgrooves. When I went back, of course, we're getting into the CDs, and then in radio, before I retired, they didn't have one record or CD in the record collection.
But it was all on hard drive.
It was all on hard drive or out from the satellite bird, but they brought people in and they sold a lot of the records, and what they couldn't sell, they put down a mine shaft, which I thought was the biggest disgrace that I've ever
dreadful.
come across.
Well,
anyway,
you're the person who's got probably the longest serving. You were the longest serving member of staff, I guess, when you
when I went
accumulate all the years.
That's right.
And I think it's terrific that we're doing this for the record, but you've also done lots of other stuff.
Yeah,
and I think one day people will appreciate what you've done too.
Well,
so thanks a lot.
I think it's good to look back.
Well, I think people need to know what's gone before, because if you don't understand what's gone before, you can't really understand the future.
Exactly.
Says he patronised. Yeah.
Very good, very good.
Okay.
Good outright.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay.